Good evening. So this evening I'm going to be talking about sacred landscapes in Roman Kent. So I'm going to start by setting the scene with what I call the traditional view. After the Claudian conquest of AD 43, the tribal elite became Romanized and lived in large, open, often palatial villas, similar to the likes of Pliny in his Tuscan villa. These villas were also often suggested as the centre of large farming estates. This example is the site at Chedworth in Gloucestershire, which is the subject of a recent National Trust monograph. In the 18th century, the British nobility started to travel around Europe on their grand tours and saw the Roman remains around the Mediterranean, particularly in Italy and especially in Rome. The natural inclination was to see the Roman ruins emerging from the ground in Britain as examples of the same phenomenon. There has been a tendency to identify all remnants of Roman masonry structures in the countryside as villas. Would the buildings at Lydney have been interpreted as a house, barn, bathhouse, and perhaps slave quarters, were it not for the mosaic inscription telling us that it was a sanctuary dedicated to the god Nodens? I would like to suggest that after 2 centuries of excavating these rural sites, that the story might not be quite as straightforward as it once seemed. Let us assume that in Kent, at least, that the indigenous tribes or clans opted to not to oppose the Claudian invasion of AD 43 and were allowed to remain on their ancestral land, and that the Roman army went elsewhere to confront native resistance. There is nothing in the archaeological record to contradict such a premise. The indigenous elite of Kent would have become the new local administration, part of the civitas, and members of the local ordo, from which the council or curia were elected and responsible to the Roman authorities for ensuring that order was maintained and that the taxes were paid on time. They might be considered as having joined the establishment. The civitates were composed of a number of pagi. Possibly as many as 100 decurions are thought to have sat on the ordo, but more likely, far less. Part of the decurions' responsibilities were to ensure the provision of religious or spiritual needs for their pagus or clan. However, they were also reliant on their own pagus members for support. They needed to be seen by the Roman authorities, their peers, and their subordinates to be successful at providing the conditions for a successful harvest year after year. And this meant keeping the gods happy. The indigenous economy of Britain and much of the rest of Europe was agricultural. Everything revolved around the farming year. Religious festivals would be held at key times of the year, and feasts would be held to celebrate a successful harvest. Water would be crucial to ensuring that crops were irrigated, and floods would provide fertile silt for the land. As an agricultural community, the land itself would have been precious. They would have seen themselves as part of the land forming a continuum between past and future, and ensuring that the ancestors were happy would have been vital. Veneration of the ancestors would therefore have been an important part of the sacred mix. Each pagus would have had their own rituals and customs to suit their own local gods and spirits, and adherence to those customs confirmed your membership of the community. Localism is key to understanding the bewildering variation in customs often observed on Roman sites. That said, the preoccupation in rural communities that were dependent on successful harvests was universal. Fertility, water, weather, and soil, whatever the actual name of the god being invoked. Many practices were linked to the fertility for the soil, the crops, the livestock, and the farmers themselves. Infant mortality was very high, but the placing of a neonatal death as an offering was surely intended to ensure a live birth in future. As part of their dual role as pagus leader and counsellor, the decurion would have been familiar with the Roman pantheon, and these and other distant gods may have been introduced to further strengthen the local beliefs and demonstrate their allegiance to the new Roman regime. Mars and Mercury were particularly popular and sometimes found represented at temple sites such as Ely in Gloucestershire, and conflated or syncretized with local gods, such as at Lydney, where Nodens was conflated with Mars to form Mars Nodens. But we should not assume that there was any coercion on the part of the Roman authorities. Adoption of a foreign deity would have been entirely a matter of choice for the British elite. And they would have done so because they felt it gave them an advantage, either spiritually, socially, or politically. Provided that there was no trouble with the indigenous people appeared to have been able to believe as they wished. This is the civitas of the Cantiaci in Kent, where we have an extensive road network linking the coast with the urban centres and the rest of the country. Note also the river systems. These were also extremely important, not only as a means of transport, but also for their role in irrigation and, of course, their sacred significance. All waterways were at the heart of spiritual belief, which would have been bound up with tribal identity. Rivers would have had their own deity and would have been seen as holy or sacred. I'm going to concentrate on the River Darent, which is particularly rich in known activity during the Roman period. This is the Darent Valley, cutting through the North Downs. The river is fed from numerous springs that rise along the valley. You can see that the river meanders across the floodplain in the valley bottom. Even today, the river floods its banks on a regular basis, especially where there's been a lot of rain. Ignore the large bodies of water here and here. These are all due to modern water management. All of the sites All of the sites marked here with a black triangle are designated as villas or parts of villas, with the exception of Frog Farm, which is a cemetery and octagonal mausoleum with a large spread of building material close by. Arguably, only Darenth and Lullingstone have been substantially excavated and reported on, although Churchfield is currently under investigation. Darenth is perhaps the exception that proves the rule, in that it is located on slightly higher ground and does not face onto the river, but to the south down the valley, and may be a candidate for a controlling villa or pagus headquarters overseeing the rest of the valley. I'd like to draw your attention to the proximity of the site to the river and ask whether you'd be happy building your home on land that was likely to flood each winter. I know I wouldn't. The river today is fast flowing, although at less than a metre deep, it is quite shallow. It has been suggested that in Roman times it would have been deeper and would have allowed navigation. However, the meandering nature of the river would have made piloting a vessel very difficult. Today, the fast current precludes even motorized boats. For the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to focus on Lullingstone. It's a very well-known site, and visitors are treated to an audio-visual presentation that explains its life as a farm and grand villa. As you can see, it sits on an artificial platform that's been cut into the North Downs to the west, looking east towards the river. Between the main house and the river is the granary, which probably accounts for its identification as a farm. Behind, on a raised terrace, is the 4th century temple mausoleum, which when excavated was found to contain the bodies of a man and a woman, both in their 20s, along with an impressive array of grave goods. The structure is thought to have been constructed over the pre-existing burials. An earlier 1st century circular shrine sat alongside, but is believed to have gone out of use before the end of the 2nd century. It is currently the only outbuilding which is still visible today. The main villa consists of a central range of grand reception rooms, complete with mosaics. To the south, there is an adjoining bath suite and associated well. To the north, there are a range of rooms which are believed to be largely sacred in character, with the cellar identified as a cult room containing a niche depicting water nymphs. Above this is what is thought to be an early example of a Christian house church. To the rear is a timber-framed structure described as a tannery or kitchen, based on the discovery of a pit containing leather goods and several ovens and an infant burial. This building is much more plausible as a shrine, containing ovens to produce sacred bread or cake, which would be used in the rituals, and very appropriate as it consists of the fruits of the produce supplied by the gods. 2 geese were found in a pit alongside this building with their wings extended, one facing north, the other facing south. It is thought that these were sacrificed at the winter or summer solstice to encourage the early return of summer. The granary is probably the main reason for the presence of the site where it is. Storage of the grain for the next year's seed grain and for feeding the pagus over the winter would have been vital. The visible storage of large amounts of grain would have been a matter of status and pride for the whole pagus, and would have been supplied to the granary from multiple farmers from across the valley. The proximity of the road would also have been important for access and status display. But why position a building that needs to be kept dry in an area prone to flooding? The river is responsible for the harvest. It irrigates the land and provides silt in the periods of flooding that fertilizes the soil. And it is the river gods, along with other fertility spirits, that need to be rewarded or appeased in order to ensure a plentiful harvest the following year. The granary, along with others up and down the valley, would have been the focal point where the decurion would have held court at times of harvest and other festivals. Important rituals would be enacted to guarantee the success of future harvest, and it is likely that the pagus would attend these festivities en masse. This probably would have meant sleeping outdoors or inside the granary for most of those present, as there are few rooms that could be identified as bedchambers in the main building. Here you can see the skeleton of a dog which was found buried beneath one of the doorways, believed to be a lurcher, and that was found on the east side adjacent to the river. There was also a genii cuculati carved out of ceramics, and it's found, and a couple of fragments of that were found in separate places and reassembled. Inside the villa, there is a very famous mosaic floor on 2 levels that represents the decurion's audience chamber. On the lower floor is the image of Bellerophon slaying the chimera, and it is a possible allegory for summer overcoming winter, which in turn is surrounded by representations of the 4 seasons, reinforcing the message of the natural progression of the seasons and leading to a bountiful harvest. You can see down here the swastika motif on the floor. This is thought to be a fertility symbol and may represent the turning of the seasons. Here is the deep room or cellar cult room. As you can see, a clear tide mark around the room where it is flooded after heavy rain. And the water had to be pumped out, which is what this contraption here is. The staff confirmed that this happens frequently over the winter months. When the room was excavated in the 1950s, the wall niche in here was in fact filled in with mortar. And it was only because of a flood that the mortar fell off and the wall painting of the water nymphs was revealed beneath. So unfortunately, it doesn't come out very well in photographs. But you can see in this drawing here the various the water coming out of the breast of this nymph and from this this urn over here. It's believed that there would probably have been a third nymph as well. In the centre of the room is a well that contains water for much of the year, and whole pots that were embedded in the floor may have been intended to retain water from the flood for the use in rituals at some later time. There is evidence to suggest that the cult room continued in use until the end of the 4th century, and possibly into the 5th. So pagan rituals would have continued at the same time as the Christian practices in the house church above. I have come back to where I started, at the typical Roman rural villa of Chedworth in Gloucestershire. Like Lullingstone, it too is artificially terraced into the hillside, with temples and shrines on the higher ground behind. It also faces the river to the east, and a central feature is an nymphaeum. Graham Webster suggested a sacred function for Chedworth in the 1980s. And this year, a new analysis of Chedworth by Bryn Walters and David Ryder has concluded the same. Is it time that we did the same for Lullingstone and many of the other villa sites in the Darenth Valley and beyond? The sacred dimension to life in Roman Britain has often been ignored, and it has been obvious, as with Lydney. It is time that we readjusted our model so that to what was actually happening in Roman Britain, rather than what was happening in Georgian England or Richard III's Britain. Thank you.